I quit being a cheap son of a bitch and I bought some new tapes. We shouldn't have the skipping around in the sound anymore. We're on to the next one. The Anatomy of the Coming Hyperinflation by Gonzalo Lira. For some time now, we have been experiencing deflation. The global depression we are in has squeezed both aggregate demand levels and aggregate asset prices as never before. Since the credit crunch of September 2008, the U.S. and world economies have been slowly circling the deflationary drain. So the Fed has bought up assets of all kinds in order to inject liquidity into the system and buoy asset price levels so as to prevent this deflationary deep freeze, and will continue to do so. After all, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Yet yields are low, unemployment up, CPI numbers are down, and under some metrics negative. In short, everything screams deflation. Therefore, the notion of talking about hyperinflation now in the current macroeconomic environment would seem, well, crazy, right? Wrong. I would argue that the next step down in this world historical global depression we are experiencing will be hyperinflation. Hyperinflation isn't what you think it is. Some people point out that a deflationary environment where commodity prices are more or less stable, there are downward pressures on wages, asset prices are failing, and credit markets are shrinking. Inflation is impossible. Therefore, hyperinflation is even more impossible. This outlook seems sensible if we fall for the trap of thinking that hyperinflation is an extension of inflation. If we think that hyperinflation is simply inflation on steroids, inflation plus, then it would seem to be the case that in our current deflationary economic environment, hyperinflation is not simply a long way off, but flat out ridiculous. But hyperinflation is not an extension or amplification of inflation. Inflation and hyperinflation are two very different, distinct animals. They look the same because in both cases the currency loses its purchasing power, but they are not the same. Inflation. Inflation is when the economy overheats. It's when an economy's consumables, labor, and commodities are so in demand because of economic growth, coupled with an expansionist credit environment, that the consumables rise in price. This forces all goods and services to rise in price as well, so that producers can keep up with costs. It is essentially a demand-driven phenomenon. Hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is a loss of faith in the currency. Prices rise in a hyperinflationary environment just like in an inflationary environment, but they rise not because people want more money for their labor or for commodities, but because people are trying to get out of the currency. It is not that they want more money, they want less of the currency, so they will pay anything for a good which is not the currency. Recovery? What recovery? Right now, the U.S. government is indebted at a level equal to about 100% of gross GDP, with a yearly fiscal deficit of about 10% of GDP and no end in sight. For its part, the Federal Reserve is purchasing treasuries in order to finance the fiscal shortfall, both directly with the recent unveiled QE Lite and indirectly through the too-big-to-fail banks. The Fed is satisfying two objectives. 1. Supporting the government in its efforts to maintain aggregate demand levels, and 2. Supporting asset prices, and thereby prevent further deflationary erosion. The Fed is calculating that either path, increase in aggregate demand levels or increase in aggregate asset levels, leads to the same thing, a recovery in the economy. This recovery is not going to happen. That's the news we've been getting at as of late. Amid all this hopeful talk about avoiding a double dip, it turns out that we didn't avoid a double dip. We never really managed to claw our way out of the first dip. The inescapable fact is that the economy has been and is headed down. Both the federal government and the Federal Reserve are hell-bent on using the same old-tire tools to fix the economy. Stimulus on one hand, liquidity and injections in the other. Fed fixes have accomplished one thing. They have undermined treasuries. These policies have turned treasuries into the spit and baling wire of the U.S. financial system. They are literally the only things holding the whole economy together. In other words, treasuries are now the new and improved toxic asset. Everyone knows that they are overvalued. Everyone knows their yields are absurd. Yet everyone tiptoes around the truth as delicately as if it were a bomb, which is actually what it is. For want of a nail. So this is how hyperinflation will happen. One day, when nothing much is going on in the markets, but general nervousness is running like a low-grade fever, as has been the case for a while now, there will be a commodities burp, a slight but sudden rise in the price of a necessary commodity, such as oil. This will jiggle treasury yields, as asset managers will reduce their treasury allocations and go into the pressured commodity in order to catch a profit. Actually, it won't even be the asset managers. It will be their automated trades. These asset managers will sell treasuries because effectively it's become the principal asset they have to sell. It won't be the volume of the sell-off that will pique Bernanke and the drones at the